As we're heading to the summer season, things are brightening up, but we had a reminder this week in Sag Harbor that there's a dark side to the region as well. I'm Joe Shaw. Welcome to 27 East Behind the Headlines. This is the first edition of our new podcast, which is going to go over the headlines of the week. I'm going to talk with the folks who put our newspapers together. That includes staff writers Cailin Riley and Jack Motz, sports editor Drew Budd, and arts and living editor Annette Hinkle. And of course, we are with the Express News Group, and we publish the Southampton Press, the East Hampton Press, the Sag Harbor Express, the website 27east.com, and Express Magazine. So we'll start with Cailin Riley. And Cailin, I alluded to it a little bit when we opened. There was a conversation at the church this weekend that was really pretty shocking. Talked about human trafficking, and it's a major issue, not just in Suffolk County, but on the East End, right?
Yeah, I mean, I went into this. If you had asked me before I attended this, do you think that the East End of Long Island is a hotbed for sex trafficking? I probably would have said no, because you think of these areas as quaint, safe, places where you sort of naively think that these bad kind of things don't happen, right? But as Alyssa Haralal, who spoke at the panel, she was one of the panelists, she was captivating. She said it could be anybody, anywhere, truly. And when you think about it, it makes perfect sense that the
It
East
really
End of
does.
Long Island is a place where this is happening. You know, she mentioned in sharing her really captivating tale of what she had gone through for so many years, that she had been sent out here so many times, right? Because when you think of the seasonal nature and all the wealth that's around here, especially in the summer season, it's like a perfect storm for sex trafficking. And I thought another thing that was brought up that was really important is this isn't just a problem that comes from the outside in. People within the community can be affected by it as well. So the whole conversation was so fascinating. It was moderated by Patricia McCormick, who Annette wrote a lovely story on last week. She's a best-selling young adult author. She lives in Sag Harbor. I've taken a writing class with her before, and I just love and adore her.
And
And
one
she
of one of her books is about human trafficking, right?
Yes. So she's a young adult author, but she tackles really heavy subject matter, but she does it in such a beautiful way. And her work is so vital because children and young adults, they need to be aware of these issues, but they need it in a way that's accessible. And so
Hmm.
her book that she published in 2006, it's called Sold. It was a National Book Award finalist. It's a fascinating book. Joe, I know you read it at my
I
urging
did,
a
yes.
little while ago. All of Patty's books are relatively quick reads, which is just another reason that no one has an excuse for not reading them. I don't think anyone has an excuse for not reading, period, but that's
Mm.
a discussion for a
The
different podcast.
the
But
other
her
great the
book,
great thing about it, it's written in the voice of a 13-year-old, and it's completely
yes,
completely convincing.
it is. And it's such a beautiful book. It tells the story of a young Nepalese girl. She's very poor, and circumstances in her family lead them to essentially sell her into sexual slavery. And she doesn't
Hmm.
realize that this is what's happening to her. So the story's told through her voice. It became, even 20 years after its publication, top of the list for most banned books in 2025. And we are having a discussion with Patty about that separately in a different podcast. But she was a perfect person to moderate this panel discussion because she traveled to India and Nepal to report on the sex trafficking there in order to write this book. And so she really understands it. And also joining her on the panel was Nina Hobson, a former British detective, and she's kind of worked in the law enforcement side of trafficking and trying to enforce it. And they were also joined by Bianca Collins, who is a member of an enrolled tribal member of the Shinnecock Nation. And she's also vice president for Hope and Resilience Long Island, which is one of the organizations on the East End that does work to help survivors of sex trafficking, domestic abuse, much like their retreat. And they really try to center the experience of the survivors. And
The,
Bianca's points were really important because women of color and indigenous women are at a much higher risk of all kinds of sexual violence, from sex trafficking to domestic abuse. And of course, most people know, or they should know, about the murdered and missing indigenous women movement. And so she spoke about that. So it was a really well-rounded, informative conversation.
yeah, I'd urge everybody to read your article. One of the things that struck me was the woman on the panel who actually came out of that community talked about how her sex traffickers really were almost like friends when they started, and that's how they sort of ingratiated themselves and made her feel at ease.
It's so insidious. And they made the point that it's not like what you see on TV where they just snatch someone off the street. There's a lot of grooming. She said she felt like she had Stockholm syndrome. She thought her trafficker was her boyfriend and cared about her. So it's
Mhm.
fascinating. It's definitely worth diving into for this
And
week.
definitely a good reminder that it's in our midst too. So really powerful story, which you can read at 27east.com. Cailin Riley, thank you very much. Appreciate you being here.
Thank you.
Let me switch over to Jack Motz, who is our East Hampton reporter. Hey, Jack.
Hey, Joe.
You had a great story this week. It's funny because I mentioned this to you after you wrote it. Sometimes a little thing comes in that we feel like we should report, and that was that there were a whole bunch of local businesses that raise shellfish in the region who got some grants from the state. That would have been just a brief that we would usually publish, but you did a really cool dive into, no pun intended, dive into this story to tell us why these places got these grants. So talk about that. What this was a really rough winter, in particular for the shellfish fishing industry.
So yeah, I really learned a lot while I was working on this story. I grew up around here. I've lived around here my whole life outside of college, and this is not something that I know a ton about. So when I got the information about the grants, I thought that it would be a good opportunity to talk to some of these people about some of the struggles in the industry and some of the things that this money will go towards. So there's kind of two things going on here. One is the grants, and that doesn't necessarily have to do with the harsh winter, right? That's kind of a separate thing that I spoke to these people about. The grants, they were awarded for infrastructure upgrades. Of the two people that I spoke to locally that received the grants were John Nicholas of the East Hampton Oyster Company and the Captain Matt and Kelsey Ketchum of Peconic Gold Oysters. And the latter, the Ketchums, they are using their grant money. They asked for $116,000. How much is going to each person is not yet announced. So the first thing is ice machines, which they say is going to save them $600 a week and a lot of time during the height of the oyster growing season, which is really huge, right? And the other thing is they applied to get a bunch of screw anchors, which will basically allow them to, lay out their lease area more efficiently, and thus grow more oysters. And John Nicholas from East Hampton Oyster Company, I think he said he has one Flupsy, which is a floating upwheeler system right now, which are like sort of, the technology that they use for growing the oysters.
Mhm.
And he applied for three more. So that's what the grant money, that's what the two folks that I spoke to locally, that's what they're, planning to put that grant money towards. And then the other thing is this harsh winter, right?
Yeah, why was it such a rough?
And
What was so rough about this winter for the folks who raise oysters and shellfish?
Right, so it's not exactly news to people that it was a very, very hard winter. There was a lot of snowfall, and the bays, had a lot of ice on them. There was a lot of ice flows. The cold itself isn't too much, doesn't give too much of an impact to the oysters. They can survive in very cold temperatures, but the ice is really a completely different problem. And really, what happens is the ice can solidify and crush the oyster cages. And so for people like the Ketchums, what they did was they sank their oyster gear underwater, right? They
Oh,
had
that's
their whole
interesting.
little, yeah, they had their own method for doing that, and they actually posted an Instagram video that kind of walked people through how to do that.
You
And
get it down under
yeah,
the ice for the winter, right?
exactly, yeah. And still, sometimes you do that, and if it's in wadable water, the ice can still impact it. That's what happened to John Barley Dunn, or Barley Dunn as he's known, who I spoke to from the East Hampton Shellfish Hatchery. They had some cages that were underwater, but they were in very shallow, wadable water, so they got impacted as well. And he runs his own, separate kind of thing on the side, and a lot of his cages got impacted by the ice. So that's pretty much what happened. That's pretty much the bottom line for the winter. And the people who went in and prepared, fared okay. The Ketchums they did, but they still had some cages destroyed. They didn't make it through unscathed. I think the numbers that Hochul and her team put out there was it was a 30% loss in production for oyster farmers broadly in the region. And some people didn't, and the Long Island Oyster Growers Association, they held a beach cleanup to go and gather oyster gear a couple weeks back, and that kind of was a little bit of an opportunity for people to assess what the actual damages were, because some people did really struggle this winter.
A rough winter. It's really nice to see Albany recognizing that industry out here, and any kind of help you can get from the state right now, I'm sure is welcome from that industry.
Yeah, absolutely. So the most recent round of grants, it was $3 million. There was another $1.2 million allotment that they did earlier. So it was two rounds of grants, and this most recent was $3 million, and it went to 14 oyster growers on Long Island, a handful of which, probably about half of which were on the East End.
Very cool. I learned a lot from that story too, just like you did. I mean, I didn't know, you know this stuff happens, but you don't really know the details. And I just thought it was a very cool little eye opener about that whole industry. So appreciate you doing it. Thanks, Jack.
Yeah, absolutely.
I want to bring in Drew Budd, our sports editor. Hey, Drew.
Hey Joe, how's it going?
Great story this week about flag football in Southampton. This is sort of a labor of love for a bunch of girls at Southampton High School, right? And they are certainly not the first school to start a flag football program, but talk about Southampton in particular.
Yeah, so Southampton is not even the first school on the East End that has flag football. East Hampton started theirs, I believe, 3 or 4 years ago, and they actually just had they just had their first overtime win, which also gave them their most wins ever in a season. So, but to swing it back to Southampton, I thought this was a very interesting story because just of how it came up. And we write about all the usual sports all the time: baseball, softball, basketball, and those programs started however many years ago, right? We're talking decades, if not a century for some of them when we talk about football, right? But it's interesting how these programs get started, and this particular program got started by two students who were just kind of interested in flag football and said they wanted to play, and that was Jada Morton and Jelia Reddick, and they were in a classroom, and their I believe it was their advisor for a club that they're both in just kind of overheard them talking about it, and that advisor was Natasha Jeffries, who is now the head coach of that team, and it all kind of just started with their wanting to play the sport, and the fact
I,
that
I,
girls flag
I,
football now has grown so much in popularity in not just in Suffolk County, but on Long Island and in general, and really in the world.
I love the story you told about how it started, which was really, as you said, the teacher sort of overhearing this conversation and then just saying, "Well, why don't you go ahead and start get some girls together,
Right.
see if we have enough girls who'd be interested, and let's see if we can make this happen."
Right, and they did a lot of kind of in-house promotion, right? So they're in this club called the Black Girl Magic Club, which was started a couple years ago by a student named London Bess, and she is now since graduated, and she now attends Howard University, and the club is really for minority young girls who need a safe space to talk about any type of things that maybe make them feel uncomfortable or just situations that they themselves find themselves in for myriad reasons, right? And so they kind of promoted the team inside the club, and that's where a lot of the players come from, but not all of them, but many of them, and that's how they kind of grew the program. But with girls flag football being so popular, this has staying power because this is just gonna it's probably just gonna grow and grow and grow, and there'll be different players that come across throughout the years, and it's really simple to kind of just get a hang of. I watched them play last week. And it was tough for them. They were playing a Riverhead Charter team that seemed to be a little bit more experienced than them, but they were having fun, and that's really what it's all about.
I gotta say, I watched the NFL draft this year, and there was a lot of conversation at the draft about girls flag football. They shined a light on it and put it in the spotlight. It really is. And how cool is it that we're actually witnessing sort of the birth of a new sport? That I think
Right.
you're right. I think this is a sport that's going to be around. I
Yeah.
don't think it's not going to flare up and go away. I think this is a sport that's going to become very, very popular.
Exactly, and that's what I find so interesting. It's not every day we get to see something like that, where a sport kind of grows, especially out here on the East End, and that's why I thought it was so interesting. Just because we are kind of like Natasha Jeffries, the coach, agreed. We are kind of witnessing history here. 50 years from now, they'll probably be talking about the first program that they started, and that I thought that was something that was pretty cool.
Yeah, it is very cool. And we should point out, flag football, one of the real appeals of it is there isn't any contact. It's not a physical sport in the sense,
Right.
regular football. One of the reasons a lot of people are, a lot of parents get nervous about kids playing football is because of the contact. This is played without contact. That's the whole point of the flags is you tackle a player by
Right.
by grabbing the flag.
Exactly. In fact, contact is actually kind of frowned upon. You really kind of have to avoid making any sort of contact. You really can't even block in the original sense. You can kind of screen, and so you really can't even make too much contact there. But it's all about grabbing the flag, and it really kind of portrays the actual skill of an athlete, just being able to avoid getting your flag taken or using your speed to run away from the person that's trying to take the flag, obviously.
In a sense, it sort of takes the best of football, like the stuff that always makes the highlights, and just sort of cuts to the chase and
Exactly.
focuses on that. Yeah,
Yeah, when
it's
you get a
great,
team
good
that's been
stuff.
doing it for a couple of years and they know how to run some plays, you really kind of see the best of the sport there.
That's very cool. Good story, Drew. Also at 27east.com for anybody that wants to go see it. And as you said, there are some other teams on the East End, right?
Right, East Hampton's had a team now for I believe it's 4 years that they started it, and they're continuing to grow. Like I said, they just won their third game, which is their most in program history at this point, and got a couple games left, so we'll see how it goes.
Yeah, so we look forward to many years of flag football. Drew, thank you for the story.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Yep, you're welcome.
So let's bring in Annette Hinkle, who is our arts and living editor. We're bringing you in for the silver linings portion of our podcast, which is where we take a look at something a little bit later that's in the news this week. And Indy Eden is always, she delivers on that front. She's always got something going on, doesn't she?
Yeah, she's really, I don't know. I feel like Inda Eaton is a kindred spirit. She's a singer-songwriter who lives in Amagansett and has lived in Amagansett for a very long time. But she exudes that sort of heartland energy, probably because she grew up in Wyoming and also Arizona, which is just a different way of being. And I feel like the last time I talked to Inda Eaton, um, was right like around COVID or right before COVID. And it was interesting because I feel like she was a little prophetic. Like she kind of felt um, like people needed to huddle down and sort of stick with their people and just sort of find strength and community. And nothing really specific had happened at that point. But so she had a whole album project called Shelter in Place, which I thought was fascinating because this came out before COVID. right?
Hmm.
But I just felt, but the whole idea, she really has that road trip sort of energy, and like you take a look at her and you just hear like the theme from some spaghetti western ringing in your head, with the tumbleweeds and and just sort of that self-reliance and that ability to kind of weather difficult world events by surrounding yourself with community. And that's kind of what she's up to now. So she's got a new project, and it's called Ind America. So it's like her first name, but the A is capitalized in America, and it's going to be the Ind America Radio Hour, where she's going to have a new radio show that is going to premiere on May 16th on a station called it's WFRM 94.5 FM, and it's The Farm. And this is owned by Bill Evans, the same individual who owns WLNG in Sag Harbor, and it's a country station. And I didn't even know about it because I don't really listen to a lot of country music. But apparently, I think that the transmitter might be somewhere in Sagaponack, which I found fascinating because there used to be a Marconi station down there, and they supposedly relayed the message from the Titanic. So
No
I really think
kidding.
there's a story that I would like to get into. So Inda's new show is going to be premiering on May 16th. But in order to kick off the show this Saturday at the Stephen Talk House at 8 p.m., she's going to do a concert there. So that's May 9th at 8 p.m.
So
at the Talk House.
that'll be the first episode of her
Well,
show is
I
basically
don't
going to
think
be.
she's even recording it for the show. I think it's just a kind of a launch party for the show. So it's just going to
Oh,
be
I see.
pretty much a straight. I think that the first edition of Ind America Radio Hour Radio Hour is already recorded and in the bag. So she'll just be performing at the Talk House this Saturday. But the show itself sounds super interesting because she's gonna really like to kind of take deep dives into Americana music and a lot of the types of music that inspired her. So you can really imagine the kind of things you can get into, from Scots Irish fiddle tunes from Appalachia to Zydeco from the New Orleans area, all sorts of African American music that's turned into blues and gospel and all sorts of things that have inspired her over the years. But I think so. It's going to be. I haven't heard the show yet, so I can't say exactly what it's going to be. But it's, I think, her mostly spinning records and not so much playing her own music, which of course
That's
she'll
what
be.
I wondered. Is she gonna? I wonder if she has plans to interview people at the same time.
I could see her bringing on special guests, but again, it's like I think she's just sort of gotten the first one in the bag, but she does want to focus on local musicians too. Like, she's friends with Gene Casey, who's a local legend, Nancy Atlas, and I think what is interesting in our talk, she also brought up a lot of other musicians who are working really hard out here, but don't have the support or the visibility of like Nancy and Gene Casey. So she's, I think, also going to find these like kind of local gems that she can bring out, and maybe she'll have them on her show. I'm not positive, so I'm kind of excited to hear how she's gonna couch all this. But she's very excited about it, and again, she does bring that energy from. And as you know, Joe, you're from not out here either. There's a different vibe out there that I feel like people like us who are from out there can introduce to this part of the world and sort of expand horizons. But for her, it's all about community and really surrounding yourself with people who are doing positive things right now.
I think the region is very much a melting pot, and that works in favor of talking about music, and especially Americana,
Mhm.
because so much of that music is about bringing stuff from all over the country and putting it together in odd ways. I also want to point out, you're absolutely right. The local musicians out here are very supportive of one another, aren't they? They really do. There's no competitiveness whatsoever. It's more about everyone boosting everyone else up. This doesn't surprise me at all that Inda's going to do a show that is going to give some of those folks a chance to come on the show and be heard.
Yeah, they show up for each other. I think that's fair to say for sure.
Yeah.
So, very exciting.
Yeah. So what's Inda doing? Is she planning a new album anytime soon? Or?
I know that she's, I don't know if she's doing a specific, we didn't talk about a specific album but she's always working on things, you know what I mean? So I'm sure that she's got a lot of stuff in the works that I wouldn't be surprised if she's gonna put that together, but I feel like, getting this radio show up and on the air is her real focus right now. And as she also says, like, she can't help but make it educational. So, she's trying not to be too preachy and stuff, but she just gets so excited when she's, talking about a record and who the people on that record may have been inspired by in a previous generation on their own record. So, and as she pointed out, the history of American music is not that long. So it's kind of it's kind of a no-brainer to make the ties between record A, was inspired by record B, which was inspired by record C, which was inspired by, going back. And I guess not unlike, our friend Joe Loro, who we had on our podcast a couple of years ago, last year, who was a collector of really rare, obscure albums that are very geared toward a very specific audience, whether it's African Americans in the South or Appalachian folks, in that part of the world. There's the whole history of record albums being put out that were just for that market. And they probably only sold, maybe, 15,000 copies, or not a lot, but that whole idea of very niche kind of recordings, I think, is fascinating. So I don't think that Inda's going to run out of any material anytime
No.
soon. So,
And it sounds like a show that I'm going to love, because that's exactly the kind of stuff I love talking about. So
we'll tune in.
thank you, Annette. Appreciate it. I want to thank Annette. I want to thank Jack Motz, Cailin Riley, and Drew Budd for being on the podcast. I'm Joe Shaw. We will be back next week with another edition of 27 Speaks Behind the Headlines.